Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine. 3 as in its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026.
Hello, welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And this time we're talking to former UK defence attaché to Moscow and to Kyiv, John Foreman, a Royal Navy veteran. He's had military diplomatic appointments in the US with NATO and the EU and has served on global maritime operations. John, welcome back to Frontline. It's great to see you again.
Hello, Kate.
So in recent days and weeks, we've seen a ramping up of false flag claims by Russia, incursions into NATO airspace, threatening behaviour at sea, particularly around the Danish Straits. This kind of political disruption is not new, but is it becoming more brazen and more widespread?
Well, I think, as you said, this stuff goes back a long time. I think the Soviet Union and the Russians were using political warfare against the West for the last century, to be honest. And it comes and goes. I think the intensity of it does ramp up and down depending on the situation at the time. But this core goal is the same: to dishearten us, to weaken us, to divide us. I don't think Russia causes the problems we have. I think Russia exacerbates them or uses them, such as concerns about immigration or concerns about Russia or security or sorting Ukraine, and then tries to exacerbate it. So I think that the strategy is the same. I think at the moment things seem to be getting more tense, shall we say. We had the incursions into Polish airspace. We had those MiGs flying through Estonian airspace, accusations of this or that. I don't think it's all Russian. I don't think it's all deliberate, but I think it feeds a sort of climate of sort of concern and fear, which I think helps Russia. So I think we should be much more discerning about what Russia is actually up to, rather than seeing the hand of Russia everywhere. But I think we've been at this really for 10 years. I think the level of the Russian campaign has been ramping up since the annexation of Crimea and beforehand. I think the penny is finally dropping in both the European Union and NATO that we need to do more about it.
And what do you think explains the current intensity?
Well, I think the 3 years into the war, I think Russian political goals are broadly similar. They want to separate the United States from NATO in particular. They want to weaken US support to Ukraine. They want to get the European publics to demand spending on, should we say, domestic concerns rather than Ukraine, and they want to leave Ukraine isolated. So, and I think the idea of them probing our defences, perhaps, or just seeing where to raise the level of tension, increases concern, and people go, well, hold on, why are we supporting Ukraine? Why should we just let Ukraine stop sending money to them? And arms and weapons and political support and leave them on their own. So I think that's been the Russian goal throughout. And I think, fortunately, it hasn't worked, actually. I think political support for Ukraine remains strong. I think military support for Ukraine remains pretty strong. But I think it's not just what we've done the last 3 years, it's sustaining that into 2026 and beyond.
Yeah, it hasn't worked because I suppose also it points out to NATO what its weaknesses might be.
Indeed. I mean, we've had, obviously, Litvinenko poisonings, we've had the poisonings in Salisbury, we've had accusations of sabotage plots, we've had accusations of assassination plots. This is all before the war. We've had, the drones, whether it's deliberate or not, but that certainly has highlighted a gap in Western air defences. And actually, I think people are doing something about it. I think people are very quick off the hoof was trying to criticise NATO, but actually NATO, I think, took stock, launched a new operation on the eastern flank. We know that investment in air defence is going on. We know investment in drone defences will now be a priority. So each time Russia does something, it highlights to the public that Russia is a threat, as we know, as we've said for the last 5 years, clearly. And secondly, it tells political leaders we need to do something about it, such as in The Hague in June, where they committed to 5% investment on defence and security. So, to be honest, strategically, Putin's it's a bit of an own goal, I think, strategically, even though tactically it inconveniences many people in the West through these sort of actions that Putin's been taking.
Because so to that point then, you think NATO's response has been adequate, it's been robust enough?
Yes, I mean, everybody's quick to shout at NATO. The 32 nations, it operates by consensus, which I think is good or bad. Obviously it takes time to make decisions. Different nations have their own viewpoints, but fundamentally they get to a position. But that consensus is actually a strength. It also polishes off some of the sort of wilder elements of national responses. And if we think the centre of gravity of NATO is its cohesion, I think that remains pretty strong. And it was good that President Trump came across in The Hague in June and reiterated US support to European security there. And I think subsequently it's good to see nations supporting Poland and other countries in the East with their air defences, but not overreacting and not listening to the siren voices, for example, that we need to retaliate against Russia militarily. I think that would be a bad thing. Or indeed to get ourselves embroiled in the conflict in Ukraine directly and risk a direct clash with NATO, with Russia. So I think there's a very careful balance, and I think NATO's just about struck it right. And I think the language being used by leaders and the language used by the Secretary General has been spot on.
I suppose that the question is what may or may not happen in future over NATO airspace. And the Financial Times is reporting today that officials are considering deploying armed drones along the Russian border and easing rules of engagement so NATO pilots could actually fire on Russian aircraft. And of course, Russia will be at pains to try and head that off by saber rattling in advance of any event like that. But do you think that that's just a natural defensive course that has to be taken?
Well, every nation has the inherent right to self-defence under international law. And I think the UK and France, I think maybe Germany went and made a démarche to the Russian government, apparently after the incursions into Polish airspace, to reiterate that all options remain on the table, including the use of armed force against Russian drones coming across the border. And I think that's quite right. So I think there's a difference between the drones and, should we say, manned aircraft. I think we have to be quite careful about our response about any manned craft incursions into NATO airspace. I think we should separate the two out. I think on the whole, my assessment of the drones is probably more accident rather than conspiracy, but it's been used by those who wish to have stronger air defences in the East as a cause to rally air defences. But if they're unmanned, they are much more likely to be targeted. And I think increasing defences and using Ukrainian expertise to improve those defences is also wise.
The ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, has described all of this as phase zero, preparations to move for a higher level of war than Russia is waging at the moment. Whether it does so or not is not something that they're offering an opinion on. But I'm just wondering, do you see it as that, or do you just see it a continuum of what we've seen before?
Well, as you probably know, I've got my beef with the Institute of Study of War, who come out with these wild predictions and prognosis which aren't based on fact. As the Chief of Defence Staff, Tony Radakin, said, there is no intelligence to suggest that Russia wants a direct clash with NATO in terms of invasion, whether that's a sort of a quick nibble, should we say, into Estonia, or full-on attack from Belarus towards Kaliningrad. I think a lot of this stuff is fantasy, and it makes headlines, but it's not grounded on fact. So, having said that, I think the political warfare, the unconventional warfare, is much more likely, as you said. I don't think Russia wants a nuclear clash. I don't think it wants a conventional clash. So I think the stuff we were describing before, this campaign of political warfare, is much more likely to endure. But I think we also have to be careful in saying it's not existential in the same way as war is. I think Russia's been very clear that it doesn't want to escalate from a local war, as it sees it in Ukraine, to a regional war with the alliance. And it's certainly not in our interest to allow an escalation from where we are now to something much more serious. So I think it's both sides' interest to dial down, to conduct direct dialogue if necessary, whilst maintaining our defence and deterrence posture.
A roadmap for strengthening European security was discussed by EU members in Copenhagen last week, and there were discussions on setting up this defensive shield, the drone wall. Where do you think, in all of this, Europe's greatest security weaknesses lie?
Well, I think firstly I'd say I read the words of the German defence minister very carefully, who was sort of, shall we say, pouring slightly cold water on the whole drone wall idea. And I do think that there are those actors in Europe who are seeking to use current sort of, shall we say, raised tensions for their own ends. And certainly the European Union, for whom I worked, is keen to move into the defence and security space at the expense of NATO. So that's been a constant refrain for years. And I think, the Defence Commissioner von der Leyen want to use defence as sort of rallying call to drive further integration and defence investment inside Europe. So, putting that aside, I think I have doubts about a drone war because at the moment the accusation seems to be that drones are flying around freely around Europe. I don't believe it, but that's the accusation. So why would a war down the east actually help? The drones are coming from somewhere, allegedly. They don't seem to be flying over the border over Ukraine, over Poland, into Germany, over to France, over to Denmark. So I think we have to be much more clearer. I mean, what I would like to see is NATO maintaining the lead for defence and deterrence in Europe, on the continent, for Europe to play its part, and then to drone defences to be part of our integrated air defences, both against all sorts of targets, not just against drones. That said, if Europe wants to put up 10 billion euros towards it, fantastic. But I don't think we should encourage overlapping, separate, uncoordinated activities for the defence of Europe.
There have been reports this week that in response to suspected cases of espionage and sabotage, EU governments are restricting the movements or wanting to restrict the movements of Russian diplomats thought to have had a hand in coordinating provocations with diplomatic cover. Were you aware of that kind of activity when you were a military attaché in Moscow? And do you think this kind of intervention can actually help?
Well, firstly, I welcome it. I think it's long overdue. I think the Russian diplomats have been using the Schengen visa to roam freely around Europe and doing all sorts of mischief. Because, let's face it, most Russian diplomats nowadays have an intelligence background and they want to conduct normal activities like surveillance or sabotage or running agents, that sort of thing. So it's taken a long time. They could have done this 3 years ago. I'm glad they're doing it now. And the UK has done something similar. We've placed restrictions on Russian diplomats around the UK, just as the Russians have placed restrictions on the British diplomats around Moscow. The Americans have had restrictions on Russian diplomats for years, so fantastic. But I think the wider point, of course, is, what diplomatic presence should we allow these countries to have? There's accusations that Vienna, for example, is a nest of spies, always has been, that in the Austrian legislation, they can't prosecute spies if they are spying outside of Austria. So I think there's a lot of nuance inside to try and clamp down on Russian diplomatic espionage activities, and the Russians use diplomatic cover for espionage across Europe.
And how aware were you of this when you were in Moscow or in Kyiv?
Well, I've been intensely aware my entire career of the threat from Russian diplomats, Russian espionage. And I think back to your other question about what can we do about it. We all focus on drones, but actually, security at home, proper counterintelligence services funding, breaking up plots, tracking through MI5 security services is probably as important, if not more important, than spending on defence at the present. Because if you think the greater weakness is our openness as a democracy, there's a whole avenue of information avenues. There's a whole set of problems we need to clamp down on, and one of those is, should we say, dubious activity by Russian diplomats.
It's interesting because that kind of argument doesn't get much traction, does it?
Well, no, I think you've got to balance it. We like living in democracy, like having freedom of expression, but what is the right balance between security and democracy? I think there's always been that tension. And I think also helping the governments explaining it to our publics to say the nature of the threat. We've had the Integrated Review 2020, the Integrated Review Refresh, the Strategic Defence Review, the National Security Strategy have all set out the threat posed by Russia, our most acute immediate threat. People would like to focus on the air incursions and nuclear threat, but I said the insider threat, the threat of Russia trying to undermine our democracy and our freedoms, our liberties, is as acute, and I think it needs investment. And I think that's why it's a missed opportunity by the Labour government to concentrate on a strategic defence review, not have a full, proper, blown, integrated strategic defence and security review at the same time. So you can balance between the two.
Just to return to the recent reporting and awareness of Russian interference, be it in terms of these false flag accusations, in terms of incursions, in terms of what's been happening at sea. How much of all of this do you think, and the uptick, is directly linked to the battlefields of Ukraine and the slow grinding nature of the war 3.5 years in?
Yes, I think Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine. 3 years in, its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026. Russia, I think Putin's overall political intent remains the same, to bring Ukraine to heel, and we have the chances of peace have become more remote. So I do see, the ramping up of these threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's espionage, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incursions, whether it's at sea or not. The evidence is out. Is part of that to ultimately to stop us supporting Ukraine. Ukraine needs money. Ukraine does not have enough money on its own to survive. So that, I think, it's about 50 billion a year short. It's going to come from somewhere. So if you weaken political support for Ukraine, Ukraine will lose. The same with arms. Ukraine is making 50-60% of its own arms. About 30% come from Europe, and about 10% of the exquisite stuff comes from America. If that doesn't come through, the 40%, Ukraine loses. So, this is existential stuff for Ukraine. The more that Russia can do to stop the European Union, NATO, and other countries supporting Ukraine, it will carry on doing it. And I think that's why it's trying to get at the public who demand and say, why is Russia doing this to us? If only we were nice to Russia, if only we sort of settled, then all these problems will go away. And I think it's the same approach, the same tactic it's been like throughout the whole Cold War, to be honest, and beyond.
How much of it is also perhaps as a result of the meeting in Alaska, which I think you told me even the Russians think was a disaster?
Well, I think I would call it a disaster. Well, not a disaster. I'd just call it a complete waste of time and effort. Trump trying to Hail Mary a peace deal without any preparation at the last minute was never going to work. That's not the Russian approach. I think the Russian wording now is it's a waste of time. Didn't lead anywhere. So we had this sort of enthusiasm that Trump would be able to bring pressure onto Russia, or apply new sanctions or supply new arms to Ukraine, meet with Putin. But he consistently along the line, he's abandoned his positions, leaving peace as remote. So I think if that peace track, shall we say, however weak, is now not on the table, then we're back to where we were before, keeping Ukraine fighting, keeping the alliance together, and imposing costs on Russia. And Russia is trying to win the war, divide the West, and isolate Ukraine. And that's honest where we've been for the last 3 years.
I mean, there was a lot of excitement recently about Donald Trump asserting that Ukraine can win, can retake all its territory, that Russia's a paper tiger. It's been nothing but words, though, hasn't it? No ceasefire, no Tomahawk missiles yet that people are getting excited about. It's said he likes a winner. Why won't he help make one?
We were discussing this earlier this week. Trump's position has been baffling. He had this whole razzmatazz during the election campaign that he alone could bring peace and do it quickly with a day, in a week, a month. It's all turned out to be extremely difficult. His position is baffling because nothing ever happens. So I don't think we should hold our breath for a change of position. I think in Trump's message about Ukraine can win, he said, "Oh, good luck to you," as if it was like a sort of bemused bystander rather than lead the free world. And I think you can compare and contrast the other big news story in the headlines about potential peace between Israel and Hamas and Gaza. Seems to be an astonishing breakthrough, which has been preceded by months and months and months of careful diplomacy and use of other nations, Egypt and Turkey and Qatar, and the Americans bringing full weight of American power on the issue, but on both sides to say, look, it's time to settle and get this done. And compare that to what the American approach over Ukraine, which has been half-hearted and weak and confused and capricious, which has led nowhere. So I think, back to your question, the ramp up of unconventional warfare, political warfare, I think is linked to the fact that we're just going to be at this for another year. There's no time to go wobbly on Ukraine, and also it's up for Europe, small e, to step up and play its part if the United States is not prepared to do that.
And notably, Ukraine just gets on with it. It continues to pound the Russian oil refineries with its long-range air campaign. Kyiv Independent now reports that restrictions on gasoline sales have now extended to a fourth region in Russia. How long do you think it can be before this does have a noticeable impact on Russia's capacity to finance the war?
Well, I think firstly, I'm glad that Ukraine is managing to have a sustained deep operations campaign against Russian oil refineries. And it seems to be having an impact on gas prices, and it's bringing home the war to Russian nationals to say they can't be moved from this. Putin's decisions leading to you not being able to travel around your country and have oil. Now, do these strikes actually lead to further economic problems? I'm not so sure. I think there's a sort of inconvenient side, but does it actually dissuade Putin from waging his war? No. Is he going to change his course? Probably not. Are there more measures that the central bank and the finance ministry can take in terms of running a greater deficit, i.e. taking on more debt, cutting spending elsewhere, using up the National Reserve? Yes, they can. So, and of course, they've still got China on their side, who's helping them support it. They're still getting arms in from North Korea. They're still trading oil products around the world via the Shadow Fleet. So places like India, who haven't haven't been dissuaded by Trump's secondary sanctions. So I think it's all to play for. The jury's out, I think, on this moment where Russian economy collapses. There's no doubt that Russia is under severe economic difficulties. But I don't think that Ukrainian drone strikes are going to bring about a collapse of the Russian economy on their own. Only concerted international action will do that.
And there is increasing optimism, though, in terms of an agreement becoming close on releasing the 200 billion or some of the 200 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets being held in Europe to fund the reparations loan to Ukraine and to repay an earlier G7 loan. How much difference, if that money is released, would that make to Ukraine's ability to survive?
Well, again, 3.5 years, we froze the assets in 2022, and here we are at the end of 2025, still discussing it. Now, I get why there's concerns by financiers about stability international system, about just taking the capital, but actually using it. The prime, shall we say, for loans, I think strikes me as a good way through it. I think we will get there. But again, I think if Ukraine needs money and support, then let's use that Russian money somehow to get Ukraine the money it needs. Let's say there's about 40 to 50 billion a year. So you're going to burn through that, if it's 200, 300 billion, quite quickly. But also sort of keep the wolf from the door. It also means that Ukraine won't have to go to nations individually and say, give us some more money, especially if the IMF or the World Bank aren't there to provide money by that path. So I think it's well overdue. Like most things, we could have been much clearer on our political objective in 2022 and 23, which would have driven action on sanctions, on arms, on use of Russian assets much, much earlier, on stopping of Russian diplomats or on diplomatic presence around Europe, rather than it dribbling out and sort of 3.5 years later we're still talking about it.
Do you get any feeling, though, that there is any more impetus for when you talk about this kind of like indecision that's lasted 3.5 years? Are you getting any kind of signs of optimism that there's more of a concerted effort to get more proactive, particularly with the fact that Donald Trump may be about to sort of wash his hands of it and leave it to Europe?
Well, I think the big change I would see in Europe is the role of Germany under Chancellor Merz, especially in comparison or contrast to his predecessor, who is, I agree with Ben Wallace, the wrong man, the wrong place, the wrong time. And then his predecessor, Chancellor Merkel, whose reputation is sort of going down the drain, down the plug hole by the day, especially by accusing the countries of Eastern Europe for some settlement with Russia. So I think German leadership is really interesting, not just about rearmament, but also about financial support. And Germany's really stepping up. I think we know that France has got its own difficulties. The UK's got its own difficulties, the other problems elsewhere. But I think on the whole, the coalition, the political support is there. Countries are leaning in to provide Ukraine with the weapons, and you'll see more and more sort of manufacturing deals, arms deals, training, diplomatic support, political support, which is good. But I think that's the right trajectory. And I think the growth of Germany, or being to actually assert some leadership after, should we say, 50, 60 years of not being willing to do that, is exemplary. And I would applaud Chancellor Merz for doing that.
It's also really important to remember, isn't it, that after 3.5 years and 1 million Russian casualties, Russia still only occupies 20% of Ukraine, and it's not winning. Does Ukraine just simply have to hold on and keep defending those front lines until such circumstances dictate that Russia does want to stop fighting?
Well, it comes down to what's the goal? I mean, is the goal just to Ukraine loses slowly or holds on, or is it Ukraine wins or there's a drive towards some sort of settlement? It's not clear to me what we've actually decided what that is. I mean, it's all well and good, keep supporting Ukraine to go backwards very slowly, but that doesn't bring any relief to the soldiers of the front line, or indeed Ukrainians being killed in Ukrainian cities. Because we're about to enter another winter, it's going to be another difficult period. We know the Russians are already targeting the Ukrainian energy production and distribution system to try and bring the war home to Ukrainians. But having an open-ended war, which just goes on for another decade, which causes more and more casualties without resolution, I don't think it's in the interest of Ukraine or Russians, Ukrainians or Russians. I don't think it's in the interest of Europeans. I think ultimately we have to decide where we want to be, what we want to achieve, and let's drive towards that rather than just sort of drifting along from crisis to crisis.
And realistically, what do you think that is, the answer?
Well, at the moment, I think for next year, it's Ukraine hanging on. I mean, one thing people point to in war is that wars can change because of circumstances. If you compare our own experience in the Second World War, we had a pretty brutal 3 years until 1943. The first 2-3 years were absolutely terrible for us, but actually things changed, pendulum shifted. But I think Putin seems to be implacable. He doesn't care about the damage being done to Russia. He doesn't care about the casualties or the money because he knows that he can't change course. And if we're not willing to fight Russia directly, which is, I think, correct, then it's enabling Ukraine to carry on fighting and taking the battle not just on the front line, but actually to deeper inside Russia.
I mean, you spoke about Putin at an event earlier this week and believe he has zero incentive for a quick ceasefire or a peace deal. Is there nothing then that can make him negotiate while his motivations for the 2022 invasion are not met?
Well, yes. I mean, I think, if you look at this, why he invaded, maybe it's a combination of resentment about Russia's, as he would see it, reduced position after the end of the Cold War, anger at not being treated seriously, a sense of entitlement, chauvinism towards Ukraine as part of Russia proper. Part of his what's his legacy, and he's getting older. Whether you want to be seen in history as a great ruler, the man who brought the Russian Empire, Russia back together again, made Russia great again. So I think waiting for him to change course through the better angels of his heart is highly unlikely. I think we have to keep on imposing political, economic, and military cost onto Russia. To drive the point home that the cost-benefit analysis for Putin, the costs are going on are so high to him personally or to his regime, are greater than the benefits of grinding out, one field at a time for the next 3 years. And I think for that, you need American leadership, and I'm not sure you're going to get that under Trump, unfortunately.
And President Putin, he was 73 this week. Same age as Xi Jinping, and we all remember them being caught off mic recently discussing the science of eternal life. What future do you think Putin now thinks is possible for himself?
I think in 2020, when he changed the constitution, he recognised that he would be dying in office, because he couldn't find a successor within the system who wouldn't go after him or his money or his family. So he had to change the constitution to become president for life, effectively. So he's now got 2 terms. He can serve up to 2036, and there's obviously ways he could carry on doing that. So I think what you're seeing is the Robert Mugabeization of Putin. He's becoming sort of the cult of personalities, sort of father of the nation figure. He reads out badly some poem by Pushkin about the Battle of Borodino, and everybody claps applauds wildly at his great magnificence and his huge intellect. So I think that's his prospect. His prospect is to remain in power and then die and then leave it to his successor. I think the problem is that every day he remains in office, the chances of bloodshed when he finally dies and his successor comes along increases. Now, I think his successor might not necessarily be so crazed about geopolitics as Putin is, about Ukraine, obsessed about Ukraine. But I think that the chances of a sort of major rapprochement between ourselves and Russia is at least a generation away. I think in the meantime, we have to maintain our security, our defences, and our deterrence against Russia.
John Foreman, great to speak to you. Thank you very much. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.